Why Dostoevsky believes suffering is the only path to truth. Why do we suffer? And why does it seem that only through pain do we truly wake up? For Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist who walked through prisons, poverty, and near death, suffering was not a curse but a revelation. He believed that every human being lives in a fog of illusions, comfort, pride, and the pursuit of happiness, until suffering tears the veil apart. Only when stripped of everything, when confronted with despair, guilt, or loss, do we begin to see reality as it truly is, raw, naked, and painfully honest. In a world obsessed with avoiding discomfort, Dostoevsky reminds us that the path to truth runs straight through the heart of anguish. His characters, Raskolnikov, Ivan Karamazov, and Prince Mishkin, are not merely fictional souls. They are mirrors of our inner struggles. Each falls, breaks, and then finds a glimpse of redemption, not despite suffering, but through it. This is the paradox Dostoevsky offers. Only those who have suffered deeply can love deeply, understand life deeply, and ultimately awaken to truth. In this journey, pain becomes the teacher, and suffering the most honest path to the human soul. Part 1. The Paradox of Pain, Dostoevsky's Search for the Soul. There is a strange and haunting law in the human condition. The more we suffer, the more we awaken. Dostoevsky's life was the living proof of this paradox. A man who was sentenced to death, who stood before a firing squad, who lost everything, his health, his freedom, his family, and yet emerged not broken, but illuminated. Out of his pain, he forged some of the most profound insights into the human soul ever written. To Dostoevsky, suffering was not an obstacle to truth. It was the truth, the crucible in which all illusions burn away, leaving only what is real. When we read Dostoevsky, we do not read for pleasure. We read to bleed with him, to descend into the depths of what it means to be human. His pages tremble with confession, guilt, despair, and ultimately, redemption. The paradox of pain, as he saw it, is that suffering doesn't destroy us. It exposes us. It strips away everything false, our pride, our vanity, our self-deception. In our suffering, we meet ourselves for the first time. 1. The early darkness, a life born in shadow. To understand Dostoevsky's philosophy of suffering, we must first understand the man who lived it. Born in 1821 in Moscow, Fyodor Dostoevsky's life began under a cloud of tension and contradiction. His father, a stern and violent doctor, ruled the family with an iron hand. His mother, by contrast, was tender and deeply religious. From childhood, Dostoevsky lived between these two poles, the cruelty of reality and the tenderness of faith. When he was only 16, his mother died of tuberculosis. Soon after, his father was allegedly murdered by his own serfs, an event that haunted Dostoevsky for the rest of his life, filling him with guilt and fascination about the nature of evil. It's no wonder that from the very beginning, his imagination was drawn to pain. His own life was marked by it. Yet what's remarkable is not that he suffered, but that he transformed suffering into meaning. While others drown in pain, Dostoevsky found in it a strange light, a painful grace. To him, suffering was not chaos. It was revelation. It was the whisper of God, calling through the silence of despair. 2. The Firing Squad, Honor, Death, and Rebirth. In 1849, Dostoevsky was arrested for participating in a discussion group that criticized the Tsar. It was a small intellectual circle, but in the paranoid atmosphere of Imperial Russia, that was enough to be condemned as a revolutionary. After months in prison, he and his companions were lined up before a firing squad. The soldiers raised their rifles, the order was given, and just as the moment of death arrived, a messenger galloped in with a royal pardon. The execution was called off. The punishment was commuted to years of hard labor in Siberia. That instant, that razor's edge between life and death, changed Dostoevsky forever. Later he wrote that in those final seconds, he felt life with an unbearable intensity. Every tree, every cloud, every breath became sacred. He realized that most people live as if they will never die, and therefore never truly live. In that instant, death had stripped him of all illusions. When the rifles lowered, a new Dostoevsky was born, one who had died once already and now saw life as a miracle. This experience is the key to understanding why Dostoevsky believes suffering leads to truth. When we come face to face with the possibility of losing everything, we see what truly matters. Suffering compresses the meaning of existence into a single blinding point. It is the death of triviality. In his near execution, Dostoevsky's soul was laid bare. From that moment, he knew that truth is not found in comfort, but in confrontation with death, guilt, and despair. 3. Siberia, the crucible of the soul. For 4 years, Dostoevsky endured life in a Siberian prison camp among thieves, murderers, and the condemned. The conditions were horrific: bitter cold, disease, violence, and humiliation. Yet it was here, in this pit of human misery, that Dostoevsky discovered the foundations of his spiritual vision. To be too conscious, he once wrote, is a disease, a real, thorough disease. In the camp, he learned that intellect alone cannot save the human soul. Philosophy, ideology, reason, all collapsed before raw human suffering. He saw that even the most hardened criminals wept when shown an act of kindness, that even among the damned, there remained a spark of humanity. This insight became central to his thought. No one is beyond redemption. Every soul, no matter how broken, carries within it the possibility of resurrection. But that resurrection does not come through avoidance or denial. It comes through suffering itself. Here lies the paradox. We think suffering destroys meaning, but Dostoevsky saw that suffering creates meaning. When everything else is stripped away, suffering reveals what cannot be destroyed. It uncovers the soul's endurance, its hunger for truth, its longing for God. In Siberia, Dostoevsky learned that salvation is not found by escaping pain, but by walking through it, with eyes open, heart shattered, and faith trembling. 4. The psychology of pain, the mirror of the abyss. Dostoevsky's novels are psychological laboratories of suffering. He dissects the human heart with surgical precision. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment murders not out of greed, but out of pride, to prove that he is above morality, a superman who can transcend good and evil. But after the murder, his mind collapses. His intellect cannot silence the voice of guilt. His suffering becomes unbearable. And yet, it is through this torment that he finally awakens to compassion. He confesses, he weeps, he accepts punishment. Through suffering, he finds redemption. In Dostoevsky's universe, sin is not the end. It is the beginning of transformation. The deeper the fall, the greater the potential for awakening. This is why his characters often experience their greatest revelations in their darkest moments. Even Karamazov, who rebels against God because of human suffering, is tormented by the realization that his intellect cannot resolve the problem of evil. Prince Mishkin, the holy fool, suffers from epileptic fits that bring him near death, and in those seizures he glimpses divine light. Each of these characters lives the same paradox. The way to truth runs through the valley of pain. To know the soul, one must suffer with it. To become human, one must descend into one's own hell. 5. Suffering as the price of freedom. For Dostoevsky, the greatest danger to the soul is not suffering. It is comfort without meaning. In The Brothers Karamazov, he tells the parable of the Grand Inquisitor. Christ returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition, and the Grand Inquisitor arrests him. Why? Because Christ gave humans freedom. The freedom to choose between good and evil, truth and illusion. The Inquisitor tells him that people don't want freedom. They want bread, security, and comfort. They want to be told what to believe. And that is the tragedy. When we flee from suffering, we also flee from freedom. Dostoevsky saw that freedom is painful because it demands responsibility. To be free is to suffer, to bear the weight of our choices, to confront the chaos within us. But only through that suffering do we become real. Without suffering, freedom decays into apathy and truth into ideology. Man is sometimes extraordinarily, passionately in love with suffering, Dostoevsky wrote, not because he enjoys pain, but because he senses that through pain, he touches something sacred. The modern world, he feared, would lose this. It would replace the sacred with comfort, in truth with distraction. People would trade their souls for convenience, and in doing so, they would forget what it means to live. 6. The religious dimension, suffering as resurrection. Dostoevsky's vision of suffering is deeply Christian, but not in a sentimental way. He did not see faith as an escape from pain, but as the courage to embrace it. Christ's truth is in suffering, he wrote. For him, Christ's crucifixion was not only a historical event, but the eternal symbol of human redemption. To suffer is to participate in that mystery, to share in the divine experience of transformation through pain. But unlike abstract theology, Dostoevsky's faith was visceral. It was born in the dirt and blood of Siberia. He did not believe because it was easy. He believed because disbelief had nearly destroyed him. In his novels, faith is always fragile, trembling on the edge of despair. Yet precisely in that fragility lies its power. True faith for Dostoevsky is not certainty. It is endurance. It is the willingness to keep loving, even when the world makes no sense. In The Brothers Karamazov, the monk Zosima teaches that each of us is guilty for everyone and everything. This is the heart of Dostoevsky's moral vision. We suffer not only for ourselves, but for the world. Our pain, if accepted with humility, becomes redemptive. It reconnects us to others, to compassion, to the divine. Suffering becomes communion. 7. The modern relevance was why we need suffering. Today we live in an age obsessed with eliminating pain. We have pills for sadness, distractions for boredom, entertainment for emptiness. Yet beneath all our comforts, there is a quiet despair, the sense that something essential is missing. Dostoevsky foresaw this. He warned that a world without suffering would also be a world without meaning. Without pain, there is no growth. Without guilt, no conscience. Without struggle, no soul. This is why his work feels more urgent than ever. Dostoevsky does not offer comfort. He offers truth, and truth burns. He shows us that the only way to heal the soul is to stop running from it, to face the darkness, to endure the contradictions, to weep, and through that weeping, to awaken. In suffering, we reclaim our humanity. Perhaps that is why people still turn to his novels in their darkest hours, because they sense that beneath the chaos, there is a strange kind of hope. Not the shallow hope of escape, but the deeper hope of transformation, the hope that pain, when faced honestly, can purify the heart. 8. The paradox resolved through the fire into light. At the end of Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov kneels beside Sonia, a poor, humble woman who has suffered greatly, and finally weeps. In her, he sees the image of unconditional love, the kind of love that can only be born from pain. This is the resolution of Dostoevsky's paradox. Suffering is not merely to be endured, but to be redeemed. When accepted with humility, it opens the soul to love, compassion, and truth. In a letter to his brother, Dostoevsky once wrote, "If someone proved to me that Christ is outside the truth, and that the truth is outside Christ, I would choose to remain with Christ rather than with the truth." What he meant was simple. Truth without love is empty, and love as he saw it is always crucified. To love is to suffer, but it is also to be reborn. Thus, Dostoevsky's philosophy of suffering is not pessimistic. It is profoundly hopeful. It teaches that through pain we become whole. Through loss we learn what cannot be lost. Through despair we discover faith. Suffering, when embraced, becomes not the end of meaning, but its beginning. 9. The eternal message. So why did Dostoevsky believe suffering is the only path to truth? Because truth for him was not a set of ideas. It was an experience. It was something that had to be lived, not merely thought. And the only experience capable of breaking through the walls of the ego, the illusions of intellect, and the numbness of comfort, is suffering. Suffering is the fire in which the false self burns away. It is the mirror in which the soul finally sees itself. It is the silence in which we hear, for the first time, the faint voice of something greater than ourselves. Dostoevsky teaches us that to suffer consciously is to awaken. To awaken is to love, and to love, even in pain, is to know the truth. 2. Into the abyss. The psychology of suffering and redemption. There is a point in every human life when suffering ceases to be an event and becomes a mirror. We stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "Who am I?" Dostoevsky understood this turning point better than anyone. He didn't write about suffering as a tragedy to be avoided, but as a mystery to be entered. He wanted to know what happens inside the human soul when it breaks, what the mind does when pushed to its edge, and how, through the chaos of despair, something sacred can emerge. To enter Dostoevsky's world is to descend into the psychological abyss, the place where guilt, pride, and the longing for redemption collide. In this descent, we discover what he discovered, that the path to truth is not found in escaping pain, but in facing it until the illusions die and the self is reborn. Fontutornen, Sirmoen Woman, the psychology of the fall. Dostoevsky's characters do not simply suffer, they fall. They descend from illusion into reality, from self-deception into awareness. But every fall in his universe is sacred. It is the beginning of self-knowledge. Raskolnikov's crime is not just a murder. It is a psychological experiment. He wants to test whether he is an extraordinary man, beyond morality. But what he really tests is the structure of his own conscience. And when he fails, when guilt floods his soul, Dostoevsky reveals something profound. The human being is not designed for godlike autonomy. The moment we try to become gods, we collapse under the weight of our own freedom. In psychological terms, this is the birth of conscience. The suffering of guilt is not punishment from outside. It is the voice of the soul trying to reorient itself toward truth. Dostoevsky was, in a sense, a psychologist before Freud, Jung, or Adler. He saw the human being as a battleground of contradictory forces: reason against faith, ego against compassion, pride against humility. And he understood that suffering is what forces these contradictions into confrontation. Pain makes the unconscious conscious. When Raskolnikov begins to suffer, he becomes human again. Before the crime, he was a theory, an idea in motion. After the crime, he becomes a person. This is Dostoevsky's first law of the soul. Suffering is what personalizes us. It turns abstraction into experience, intellect into empathy, and theory into truth. 2. The fragmented self, the war within. Long before modern psychology discovered the idea of the divided self, Dostoevsky wrote characters who were split between warring identities. He saw that within every person lies a conflict between the desire for purity and the temptation of chaos. His characters are not villains or saints, they are both at once. That's why they feel so real, because we recognize their struggle in ourselves. In Notes from Underground, the unnamed narrator is one of literature's most psychologically naked figures. He despises society, mocks morality, and prides himself on his intellect. Yet beneath all his cynicism lies a deep wound: the inability to love. His suffering comes from the war within, the intellect that isolates him and the heart that yearns for connection. "I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man," he confesses. But his spite is a defense mechanism, an armor against the vulnerability of being human. For Dostoevsky, this split between reason and feeling, between pride and humility, is the source of all psychological suffering. The modern person, he believed, is sick because we have become alienated from our own souls. We hide behind rationality, behind the mask of success and intelligence, because we fear the pain of being seen. But that pain, the pain of exposure, of honesty, is the only door to healing. To be redeemed, one must be broken. Flaw 3. The pain of self-revelation. Dostoevsky's psychology is built on one radical truth: suffering reveals the self. When life is easy, the ego remains unchallenged. We live in habits, illusions, mechanical comfort. But when pain strikes, when loss, humiliation, or guilt rips through the facade, the masks fall away. We are forced to confront who we are beneath all the stories we tell ourselves. That is why Dostoevsky's characters often reach enlightenment only through despair. The more they suffer, the more they see. Raskolnikov sees the emptiness of his pride. Even Karamazov sees the limits of his intellect. Even Svidrigailov, the libertine, faces the horror of a life without meaning before he takes his own. In each case, suffering is the mirror of truth. It strips the soul of pretense. Modern psychology echoes this. Carl Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." Jung's entire theory of individuation, becoming whole by integrating the shadow, is a psychological translation of Dostoevsky's spiritual insight. We suffer because we are divided. Redemption begins when we stop running from the darkness and allow it to speak. For Dostoevsky, that darkness is not evil in itself. It is potential. To repress it is to become a hypocrite. To face it is to become human. Only when a man admits his capacity for cruelty does he begin to understand compassion. Only when he confronts his pride does humility become possible. Pain, then, is the process of integration, the burning through of the false self so that the soul can emerge. 4. The role of guilt, the fire of conscience. In Dostoevsky's universe, guilt is not simply psychological torture. It is the beginning of grace. Guilt is the soul's alarm bell, the proof that morality is not imposed from outside, but inscribed within. Modern culture tends to pathologize guilt, to treat it as a neurosis to be eliminated. But for Dostoevsky, guilt is sacred. It is the cry of conscience that reminds us of our connection to others. Raskolnikov's suffering is not caused by the police who chase him, but by the inner trial that never stops. His real punishment begins long before his arrest, in the sleepless nights, the hallucinations, the fevered guilt. His confession to Sonia is not a legal act. It is spiritual catharsis. He cannot bear the lie any longer. In that confession, he is reborn. Psychologically, Dostoevsky understood something timeless. Guilt, when faced, leads to transformation. Guilt, when denied, leads to madness. Even Karamazov, who refuses to accept guilt for his father's murder, collapses into delirium. The underground man who refuses to repent descends into isolation and spite. But those who embrace guilt, who confess, weep, and accept punishment, find peace. Redemption in Dostoevsky's view is not the erasure of guilt, but its transfiguration. 5. Love is the healing of pain. If suffering reveals the truth of the self, love is the force that redeems it. But for Dostoevsky, love is not easy or sentimental. It is crucifixion. True love demands that we suffer with others. It requires empathy so deep that we carry another's pain as our own. The capacity to love, in his eyes, is directly proportional to the capacity to suffer. This is why the purest characters in his novels are also the most wounded. Sonia in Crime and Punishment sells her body to feed her family. Prince Mishkin in The Idiot is ridiculed and humiliated for his compassion. Alyosha Karamazov in The Brothers. Karamazov bears the grief of his family and his faith. Their love does not protect them from suffering, it multiplies it. And yet, in their suffering, they become luminous. They show us that love is not the opposite of pain, but its transformation. Psychologically, Dostoevsky's view anticipates modern theories of empathy and attachment. He saw that isolation, the refusal to feel others' pain, leads to despair. Only through connection can the self find healing. When Raskolnikov kneels before Sonia and finally confesses, it is not an act of submission, it is an act of love. He allows himself to be seen, forgiven, embraced. The wall between self and other collapses. In that collapse, redemption begins. 6. The neurosis of modern man. Dostoevsky foresaw the psychological condition of the modern world, the underground condition. In our quest to avoid suffering, we have created a culture of denial. We chase pleasure, distraction, and control, but the cost is inner emptiness. We repress guilt, silence conscience, and numb ourselves to pain. Yet the unconscious never forgets. The more we avoid suffering, the more it haunts us from below. The underground man is the prototype of the modern neurotic. He is intelligent but paralyzed, self-aware but self-destructive. He wants to act but cannot. He wants to love but fears it. He is trapped in his own mind, a prisoner of analysis. His suffering is not physical, it is existential. He suffers because he cannot believe in anything. His intellect has consumed his soul. Dostoevsky saw this as the great psychological disease of modernity, the disconnection between intellect and faith, reason and meaning. Without suffering, he warned, the soul becomes sterile. Pain is the bridge between the mind and the heart. When we deny it, we lose both. The modern person's endless distractions are merely attempts to fill the void left by the absence of suffering with purpose. 7. Descent and resurrection, the cycle of redemption. Every Dostoevskian story follows a pattern: sin, suffering, confession, redemption. But this is not moralism, it is psychology. Suffering breaks the ego, confession exposes it, and redemption integrates it. The process mirrors what depth psychology later called death and rebirth. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov's descent into guilt is his death. His confession and love for Sonya is his resurrection. In The Brothers Karamazov, Ivan's breakdown is his descent. Alyosha's forgiveness is his resurrection. In The Idiot, Mishkin's epileptic fits, his temporary deaths, open him to divine vision. For Dostoevsky, every psychological fall has the potential to become a spiritual ascent. Redemption, then, is not a supernatural miracle. It is a psychological transformation. It is the integration of suffering into meaning. To redeem oneself is to take ownership of one's pain, to see it not as punishment, but as participation in something greater. This is the alchemy of the soul, turning agony into compassion, guilt into humility, and despair into faith. 8. The freedom to suffer. Here lies Dostoevsky's most radical psychological insight. The freedom to suffer is the freedom to be human. When we refuse suffering, we surrender to control. We let systems, ideologies, and institutions protect us from pain. But in doing so, we give up our souls. The Grand Inquisitor's logic still rules modern life. People would rather be comfortable slaves than suffering free men. True freedom, Dostoevsky insists, is the courage to face one's own pain without anesthesia. It is the ability to stand in the fire and say, "This suffering is mine, and through it, I will become real." This is the psychological path to redemption, not escape, but endurance. The one who can bear suffering consciously gains mastery over life. The one who flees from it becomes its slave. This is why, for Dostoevsky, redemption is not a gift. It is a victory of the soul over despair, of meaning over absurdity, of love over nihilism. Redemption is what happens when a human being says yes to life, even in its darkest hour. 9. The light beyond despair. Dostoevsky's psychology ends not in despair, but in illumination. For all his darkness, his final message is radiant. He believed that within every human being, no matter how broken, guilty, or lost, there exists an unkillable spark. That spark is the image of God, the seed of truth. Suffering reveals it. Through the abyss, we find light. In the final pages of Crime and Punishment, after years in prison, Raskolnikov opens the New Testament Sonya has given him. He reads the story of Lazarus, the man resurrected from the dead. And in that moment, we understand the entire message of Dostoevsky's psychology. Suffering is the tomb, redemption is resurrection, and truth is life reborn from death. In psychological terms, the soul must die to its illusions in order to be reborn into consciousness. The ego must suffer defeat for the heart to awaken. And yet, through this painful process, the human being becomes whole. 10. The abyss is revelation. To go into the abyss is to meet oneself, to confront the shadow that lurks beneath the surface. Dostoevsky does not tell us to seek suffering for its own sake, but to stop running from it. Because every time we run, the shadow grows stronger. The only way out is through. To look into the abyss is terrifying, but it is there, in that darkness, that truth waits. This is the ultimate paradox. The deeper the suffering, the closer to redemption. The more complete the despair, the more total the awakening. For Dostoevsky, hell and heaven are not places. They are psychological states. Hell is separation, from love, from truth, from others. Heaven is reunion, the healing of that separation, and the bridge between them is suffering. Conclusion: the soul's alchemy. Dostoevsky's psychology of suffering is not pessimism, it is spiritual realism. He teaches that suffering is not a detour from life, it is life's engine. It tears down the walls of illusion and rebuilds the soul on foundations of truth. Every pain, if faced consciously, becomes an invitation to awaken. Every descent into darkness carries within it the seed of light. Modern psychology often asks how to avoid suffering. Dostoevsky asks how to redeem it. And that question, how to transform pain into meaning, remains the most profound psychological and spiritual challenge of our time. Because in the end, suffering is not just what happens to us, it is what reveals who we truly are. Part 3, the resurrection of truth. freedom, faith, and the human spirit. When a man has suffered enough to see through every illusion, what remains? After the abyss, after guilt, after despair, what stands at the end of pain? For Dostoevsky, the answer is not mere survival, it is resurrection. The soul that has walked through death does not return as it was. It returns transfigured. This, for him, is the ultimate truth. Only through suffering does the human being awaken to the sacred freedom of love, to the faith that survives reason, and to a spirit stronger than despair itself. We have followed Dostoevsky down into the pit. Now we follow him back toward the light, toward the rebirth of truth within the wounded soul. One, from darkness to dawn. Every resurrection begins in darkness. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov's final awakening happens not in triumph, but in exhaustion. After months of fever, guilt, and exile, he opens the small New Testament that Sonia has given him. He reads the story of Lazarus, the man called back from the tomb, and something stirs. Not joy, not relief, but a quiet recognition. This is what must happen to me. Dostoevsky's concept of resurrection is psychological as much as spiritual. The person who has truly suffered dies to the false self, the self built on pride, reason, and isolation, and rises as a creature capable of love. This is why the resurrected are never the same. They no longer seek perfection, they seek meaning. They no longer demand certainty, they choose faith. They no longer judge, they understand. Resurrection for Dostoevsky is not an escape from the world, but a radical re-entry into it, with new eyes cleansed by tears. Secular Surreur, 32, the freedom of the redeemed. Most people, he believed, do not actually want freedom. They want comfort disguised as freedom, security, pleasure, predictability. But true freedom, spiritual freedom, is terrifying because it carries responsibility. In the Brothers Karamazov, the Grand Inquisitor accuses Christ of burdening humanity with too much freedom. You gave them bread from heaven, he says, but they would rather worship the one who gives them ordinary bread. The Inquisitor's argument is diabolically compassionate. People cannot bear the anxiety of freedom. They prefer to surrender their conscience in exchange for certainty. Dostoevsky saw this temptation everywhere, in politics, in religion, in ideology. The moment we trade suffering for comfort, we lose our humanity. Freedom without suffering is anesthesia, but freedom through suffering, that is redemption. When the soul has suffered enough to see that no one else can save it, it finally becomes free. The resurrected person no longer blames fate, society, or God. He takes up his cross voluntarily. He suffers consciously, and therefore he lives consciously. That, Dostoevsky believed, is the only real freedom left to humanity. 3. The psychology of faith. Dostoevsky did not come to faith through dogma. He came through despair. He doubted everything, argued with God, and yet, after all the darkness, chose to believe. Why? Because reason had shown him its limits. Intellect alone could analyze the world, but not endure it. He once wrote, "I believe in Christ and confess him not like a child, but through my own hell." For him, faith was not the absence of doubt. It was the courage to keep loving in the presence of doubt. Psychologically, this is the leap beyond nihilism. When the mind realizes it cannot rationalize meaning, the heart must create it. Faith, then, is the act of rebellion against despair. It is the will to affirm life even when logic cannot justify it. In Jungian language, faith is the integration of the shadow, the acceptance that light and darkness coexist within the soul, that love persists even in chaos. Dostoevsky's resurrection of faith is therefore not naive optimism, it is mature realism. The believer who has walked through hell believes not because the world is good, but because love remains possible within it. 40 year, des filles pour 4, love is resurrection. In every Dostoevsky novel, love appears not as sentiment, but as salvation. Sonia's compassion resurrects Raskolnikov. Alyosha's gentleness heals Ivan. Even in The Idiot, Prince Mishkin's childlike love, though misunderstood, awakens those around him to their buried humanity. Why? Because love, in Dostoevsky's psychology, is the ultimate antidote to isolation. It unites the fragmented self with others and with God. But true love demands suffering. It means sharing in another's pain. Without that crucifixion, love becomes mere comfort. When a person loves through suffering, something miraculous happens. Pain loses its bitterness. It becomes luminous, meaningful, even redemptive. This is the mystery Dostoevsky called active love. Love that acts despite despair, that chooses compassion in the face of cruelty. Such love resurrects the soul because it reverses the logic of ego. The self no longer asks, "What do I gain?" but "Whom can I serve?" The ego dies and the human spirit is reborn as communion. Surah 5, the human spirit and the image of God. Dostoevsky's Christianity was not about obedience to rules, but recognition of the divine image in every person. He had seen murderers in Siberia weep over a bird. He had seen prostitutes pray for strangers. Beneath the grime of sin, he saw the indestructible spark of spirit. This conviction gave his work its moral intensity. If every soul bears the image of God, then no one is beyond redemption. Even the vilest act can become the soil of transformation if met with repentance. But that same truth also condemns cruelty. To degrade another is to blind oneself to that image. The resurrection of the human spirit, then, begins with recognition, seeing the divine in others and in oneself. This vision is not granted cheaply. It is born from suffering. Only those who have been humbled can truly see the sacredness of others. Pride blinds. Pain opens the eyes. 6. The community of the resurrected. No one is saved alone. Dostoevsky's world is a web of intertwined destinies, where one person's redemption often begins with another's compassion. Sonia's faith resurrects Raskolnikov. Zosima's wisdom redeems the Karamazovs. A stranger's kindness in Siberia rekindles Dostoevsky's own belief in humanity. This interdependence forms his vision of the community of the resurrected, a fellowship of those who have suffered, confessed, and learned to forgive. Their unity is not institutional but spiritual. It is bound by shared pain and shared hope. In modern psychological terms, this is the healing power of empathy and shared narrative. Trauma isolates, but storytelling restores. To tell one's pain and have it understood is to rejoin the human circle. Dostoevsky understood this intuitively. Confession is not humiliation. It is communion. When we reveal our wounds, we give others permission to reveal theirs. And in that mutual exposure, the human spirit rises from the dead.